Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Whispers of the Hollow Star. The town of Havenwood was a place that clung to the earth. It smelled of damp soil after a summer shower, of pine needles baked by the sun, and, in the case of Kael's garage, of oil, hot metal, and ozone. The garage sat at the edge of town, a corrugated steel box where the mundane dramas of failing transmissions and worn brake pads played out. It was a fortress of grit and grime, a perfect hiding place for a fallen prince nursing the wounds of a shattered cosmos. Into this world of tangible things, Nova Wren sputtered, her vintage mint-green scooter sighing its last breath at the threshold. She was a creature of the intangible, a doctoral candidate in astrophysics whose mind lived trillions of miles away in the silent waltz of distant galaxies. Her hair was a chaotic knot, a pencil stuck through it like an axis pin, and her eyes, the colour of a hazy dusk, were wide with the frustration of being violently returned to Earth. She saw him emerge from the cavernous dark of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag that seemed to have long ago surrendered to the grease. He was all sharp angles and lean muscle, clad in a faded black t-shirt and jeans that bore the stains of his trade like a second skin, but it was the details that snagged the breath in her throat. From the collar of his shirt, intricate tattoos coiled down his arms, spirals and lines that looked less like ink and more like captured starlight, forming constellations she had never seen catalogued in any atlas, terrestrial or celestial. His hands were stained dark, yet his eyes held the deep, silent, unending expanse of a moonless night sky. "Broke down!" His voice was a low rumble, like stones settling deep underground. "It would appear its terrestrial journey has concluded," Nova murmured, her cheeks flushing. "It usually gives a warning, a sort of pathetic little cough. Today it was just silence." It was absurd. One look at him, and the carefully catalogued constellations in her head felt incomplete, as if he were a missing part of the map. He moved toward the scooter, his presence a strange magnetic field that made the air feel thick. As he leaned over to inspect the engine, she stepped aside and the back of his hand brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and clean as a lightning strike, passed between them. For Nova, the world dissolved into a dizzying flash of silver light, the air filled with a sound like wind chimes struck by a meteor shower. For Kael, it was agony. A psychic echo brutal and unwelcome of a sunlit plaza, a woman with hair like spun silver, and a grief so profound it had once shattered a star system. He recoiled, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his lips. He masked it as a reaction to a hot engine part, but his knuckles were white where he gripped a wrench. "Sorry," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Static." But Nova knew it wasn't static. She had felt it, a current of pure, unadulterated information, a story without words. She watched, mesmerized as he worked. His movements were not those of a simple mechanic. They were precise, economical, and imbued with a grace that seemed at odds with his gritty surroundings. He didn't just diagnose the problem, he seemed to commune with the machine, his long fingers tracing wires and pipes with an intuition that was almost supernatural. The low, discordant hum of the broken engine became, under his touch, a steady, purring thrum. Finding her voice, she tried to fill the charged silence. "I was just on my way up to the ridge, to watch the Perseids." She gestured vaguely upward. "My rooftop is good, but the light pollution, you miss the faint ones." He didn't look up, his focus absolute. "Everyone looks at the stars. It's looking back that's the problem. The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning she couldn't grasp, an unsettling wisdom that had no place next to a rack of tire irons. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, feeling the need to connect this man of earth and metal to her world of light and gas. Some ancient cultures believed falling stars weren't rock, but tears, she mused aloud, her voice soft. Or messages. Imagine being so important, so loved, that the heavens wept for you. He froze, the wrench in his hand stilled. He slowly straightened up, turning to face her. The deep space in his eyes was no longer quiet. It was haunted. A storm was gathering in their depths, a tempest of ancient pain. He looked at her as if she had just spoken the name of a ghost, a name he'd spent centuries trying to forget. The scent of rain on the hot asphalt outside mingled with the sharp, clean smell of ozone that seemed to cling to his very skin. And in that moment, Nova Wren felt the solid ground of her scientific world begin to crumble, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling sense of cosmic wonder. He was the secret the night sky had been keeping, and she had just stumbled upon it. The dreams began that night. They were not the usual anxiety-fueled rambles of a PhD student, but vivid, hyper-realistic fragments of a life not her own. Nova walked through cities of living crystal that sang in the light of a binary sun. She heard a language that felt not like sound, but like pure emotion poured directly into her soul. And in every dream, there was a profound, aching grief for a woman with hair of spun silver, a woman she'd never met but missed with the force of a physical wound. Watching over it all from a balcony of obsidian, or the prow of a light ship, were Kael's eyes. Not as they were in the garage, guarded and shadowed, but brighter, blazing with a power that shaped the very starlight around him. She awoke each morning with the ghost of tears on her cheeks and the scent of ozone in her nostrils. The tidy, logical world of her apartment, with its stacks of books and meticulously drawn star charts, felt like a foreign country. The universe she studied through lenses and data was now a place she had seemingly walked in her sleep. 2 days later, she found herself back at the garage. The official reason was a follow-up on the scooter, a machine now running with a perfection it had never known. The real reason stood under the glare of the work lights, his celestial tattoos a stark, beautiful mystery against his skin. "It's running perfectly," she said, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Too perfectly, and he merely nodded, his gaze steady. "I tuned the resonance manifold. They fall out of alignment easily." Resonance manifold. There was no such part on her scooter. She let it go. "I've been having the strangest dreams," she began, the words spilling out before she could stop them. She described the crystal spires, the music, the feeling of loss. She didn't dare mention his presence in them. But then, compelled by an instinct she couldn't name, she added, "And there was this image, a star that was collapsing but into itself. It was dark on the inside, a hollow star." The heavy wrench in Kael's hand slipped, clattering to the concrete floor with a deafening clang. He stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The gruff mechanic was gone, replaced by something ancient and raw. He looked flayed open, his soul exposed. The hollow star was not a dream. It was the name of his sin, the celestial tombstone of his making. Later that evening he appeared at her apartment. He brought a peace offering, a small intricate gear he had machined from a block of stainless steel, its teeth cut with impossible precision. It was cool and heavy in her palm, a piece of his world offered to hers. "For the resonance manifold," he said, his excuse flimsy. She let him in. Her small living room, fragrant with the scent of chamomile tea and old paper, seemed to shrink around his presence. The conversation was stilted at first, dancing around the edges of the chasm that had opened between them. He spoke of running, of a past that was relentless. She spoke of the sky, of feeling a connection that went beyond science, a sense of homesickness for a place she'd never been. His inner monologue was a silent scream. She speaks of my home as if she'd walked its silver streets. Each word is a grain of salt in a wound I thought had scarred over centuries ago. Does she know she is resurrecting a ghost? One clear, cold night, he found her on the rooftop, her small observatory a sacred space surrounded by the sleeping town. The sky was an ocean of diamonds, vast and achingly beautiful. She was pointing out constellations, her voice full of academic reverence. "That's Cassiopeia," she said, tracing the W in the sky. "And there, Andromeda, our sister galaxy." He stood beside her, the chill night air raising goosebumps on her arms. "The people who came before you had other names for them," he said softly, his voice a low counterpoint to the crickets below. He pointed to a cluster of stars she knew as the Pleiades. "That is the Veiled Sisterhood, the Weavers of Fate," he gestured to Draco, "and that is not a dragon. It is the great riftworm who devours dying light." They were names no human scholar knew, names that felt older than language itself. The air between them crackled. The professional distance she had tried to maintain evaporated into the cold night. "My dreams," she whispered, turning to face him. "They don't feel like mine. They feel like memories, and you're always there. Not as you are now, but brighter." He looked away from her, up at the star-dusted heavens that were once his birthright and now served as the ceiling of his prison. A profound sadness emanated from him, a loneliness so immense it felt as if it could swallow the moon. "I come from a long way away," he finally admitted, the words torn from him. The unspoken questions hung between them, shimmering with a desperate rising attraction. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell that strange, clean scent of starlight and storms. In that moment, standing on a rooftop in a sleepy town, Nova understood that her fascination with Kael was not just an earthly crush. It was a gravitational pull, an astronomical event, centuries in the making, and she was already caught in its orbit. The storm did not arrive. It descended. One moment, the afternoon was thick with the humid, heavy air of late summer. The next, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple-grey. There was no wind, no distant rumble of thunder, only an oppressive, unnatural stillness that choked the air and made the hairs on Nova's arms stand on end. It was in this claustrophobic quiet that the hunter came to Havenwood. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a being of pure will and void, drawn across galaxies by the sudden, brilliant flare of Kael's resurfacing celestial energy. His connection to Nova, the echo of his long-lost love, had been a beacon in the cosmic dark, and the hunter had followed it to its source. The first attack came as Nova slept. Her dreams of crystal cities and sung languages curdled into nightmares. The silver-haired woman now dissolved into screaming dust before her eyes. The musical language became a cacophony of shrieking discord. The beautiful hollow star was no longer a distant, sad spectacle. It was a hungry maw, pulling her into its cold, empty void. She was tossed through dying galaxies, past worlds of ash and frozen silence, the chill of absolute zero seeping into her bones. She woke with a strangled scream, her body slick with sweat, the cloying smell of burnt ozone and decay thick in her room. Kael felt the psychic assault like a physical blow. It was the signature of a void hunter, a celestial custodian tasked with purging cosmic anomalies. He was the anomaly, and now it was using Nova as bait. He was at her apartment in minutes, the unnatural storm now breaking in a deluge of thick, oily rain that lashed against the windows. He found her huddled in a corner of her bed, shivering, her eyes wide with a terror that was not of this world. The air in the room was cold, imbued with a palpable malevolence. "It was in my dream," she stammered, her teeth chattering. The cold, the emptiness. He saw the tendrils of shadow coalescing in the corners of the room, a darkness that swallowed light. He knew what he had to do, his long exile, his vow of non-interference. It all meant nothing if she was lost. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of desperation. Nova, look at me. His voice was a command, sharp and clear. Don't look away. He placed his hand on her forehead. It was a gesture of profound intimacy and terrible necessity. He closed his eyes and reached for the power he had kept leashed for centuries, the very essence of his being he had sworn to hide. The intricate tattoos on his arms, from his wrists to his shoulders, began to glow. It started as a faint silvery light, then intensified, burning through the fabric of his shirt. Molten silver light traced the alien constellations across his skin, and a wave of pure, clean starlight flooded the room. It was not a hot light, but a cool, powerful luminescence that smelled of distant nebulae and creation itself. The oppressive darkness recoiled, the shadow tendrils hissing as they dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. Nova gasped, her terror shifting its focus. She saw it all. The impossible light pouring from him, the raw power that warped the very air around him. The shadows fled not from a man, but from a god. The kind, gruff mechanic who had fixed her scooter, who smelled of oil and rain, was a vessel for something vast, powerful, and utterly terrifying. When the light subsided, he slumped against the bed, breathing heavily, the glow fading from his skin, but the scent of starlight remaining. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. But she was already pulling away, scrambling to the far side of the bed, her face a canvas of disbelief and fear. It wasn't the hunter she was afraid of anymore. It was him. That light, she whispered, her voice trembling, broken. That was in my nightmare. Your hands, God, what are you? The question hung between them, a chasm of otherness, of fear, of a truth so immense it had shattered the fragile reality they had begun to build. His face, etched with an agony that seemed older than time itself, crumpled. I am the reason they are hunting you, he said, his voice raw with a pain that ripped through her more keenly than any nightmare. I am the crime you're paying for. The garage was a maelstrom. Rain hammered against the steel roof in a relentless, deafening rhythm, while lightning tore open the ski, casting the cavernous space in strobes of violent apocalyptic light. Tools and machinery, once symbols of earthly labour, now threw monstrous shadows that writhed and danced on the slick, oil-stained concrete. It was here, in the place of their beginning, that it would end. The Void Hunter materialised in the centre of the floor. It was no longer just a psychic presence, but a cohesive form, a shifting humanoid silhouette of absolute blackness, a hole in reality that drank the light around it. Its intention was a palpable wave of cold certainty. It had come to reclaim the exile, Kael, and to extinguish the Echo Nova, whose very existence was a cosmic imbalance. Kael stood between Nova and the creature, his body thrumming with a terrible energy. He had tried to run, to hide, to atone in silence. Now he realised the only way to protect her was to unleash the full horrifying truth of what he was. He glanced back at her, his eyes blazing with a mix of love and despair. Don't look away, Nova, he commanded, his voice ringing with celestial authority. Please, bear witness. Then he turned to face his judgment. With a guttural roar that was not human, he shed his mortal guise. The tattoos on his body didn't just glow, they erupted, burning across his skin like molten silver, his entire form shimmering, destabilizing, flickering between the man she knew and a being of pure incandescent starlight. The fight was brutal and elemental. The hunter moved with the silence of the void, its limbs stretching into blades of shadow. Kael met it with raw power, blasts of light that slammed into the darkness with the force of supernovas. The air crackled, smelling of ozone and burning metal as wrenches were thrown, engines were toppled, and the very structure of the garage groaned under the strain of cosmic forces it was never meant to contain. Nova, huddled behind the wreck of a half-restored motorcycle, watched in terror. But as the fight raged, her fear began to transform. She saw past the blinding light and the terrifying power. She saw the pain on Kael's face as he fought, the agony of every blow, the desperation of a being fighting not for his own life, but for hers. She saw the lonely, haunted man who had fixed her scooter, the quiet soul who had drunk tea in her cluttered apartment. He was still in there. He was her Kael. As the hunter gained the upper hand, wrapping Kael in tendrils of life-draining shadow, Nova stood up. Overcoming the instinct to flee, she found her voice. "Kael!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the cosmic chaos. "Kael, I'm here. Don't let it take you." Her voice, so fragile and human, was the one thing the void could not touch. It was an anchor. Kael's head snapped up, his brilliant eyes finding hers. In that moment of connection, he found a new strength. With a final, blinding burst of energy, he tore the shadows from his body and drove his fist, a conduit of pure starlight, into the heart of the hunter. There was a silent implosion, a rush of cold air, and the creature dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the sound of the rain and their ragged breathing. Kael collapsed to his knees, his celestial light flickering violently. He was depleted, raw, caught between his two forms. His skin pulsed with a soft, silvery glow, the tattoos swirling like galaxies beneath the surface. He was beautiful and terrifying, a fallen god on a floor of oil and grit. Nova didn't hesitate. She ran to him, her fear gone, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness that overwhelmed everything else. She knelt before him in the wreckage, the rain-soaked air thick with the scent of oil and otherworldly starlight. "Okay?" she whispered, her own tears mixing with the rain dripping from her hair. "You're okay." She reached out a trembling hand and traced the glowing lines on his arm. His skin was impossibly warm, thrumming with a faint vibration. He flinched, not from pain, but from a tenderness he had not known for eons. "Nova," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a desperate, hungry collision of worlds. It was the kiss of a dying star and a sunrise, of fervent grief and sudden, fierce hope. It tasted of rain and tears, of ozone and blood. It was a claiming. Clothes became an impediment, a barrier between two souls who had just witnessed the truth of each other. They were shed not in clumsy haste, but with a sense of reverence, falling away onto the cold, damp concrete. Her hands, brave and certain, explored the strange, new geography of his body. She traced the pathways of his glowing tattoos, feeling the cool, underlying light beneath the heat of his skin. He was no longer just a man, he was a living map of the heavens, and she was learning his terrain by touch. He worshipped her in return, his hands and mouth discovering the soft human warmth of her. He touched her as if she were the most fragile, sacred thing in all of creation. His lips traced the curve of her throat, the swell of her body, the gentle slope of her hip. Each kiss, each caress, was both a question and a statement, an act of reverence for the mortal woman who had seen his monstrous truth and had not run. He laid her back on a pile of discarded shop coats, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the unbearable sensitivity of her skin. When he rose over her, his body was a constellation of soft, pulsing light in the gloom of the ruined garage. As they moved together with a slow, deliberate reverence, each movement a reclamation of a soul he thought was lost. As he moved with her, finding his new true north in the heat and tightness of her body. Her gasps were not of this world, but of a soul recognizing its counterpart across time and space, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure that echoed the chime of stars being born. The climax was not a release, but a fusion. A silent, blinding flash of shared light erupted from where their bodies joined. A supernova of spirit and flesh that left them trembling in the wreckage, bound together, irrevocably, by the sacred act of being truly seen. Dawn broke over a rain-washed Havenwood, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and nascent possibility. In Kael's sparse apartment above the garage, the soft morning light filtered through the single window, painting stripes across the tangled sheets and the two figures entwined within them. The celestial glow that had coursed over Kael's skin had subsided, leaving behind only a faint silvery shimmer, like moonlight trapped beneath his flesh, visible only to her. They lay in the quiet aftermath, their bodies still humming with the echoes of their cataclysmic union. The threat was gone, but the truth remained, a new universe waiting to be navigated between them. He turned to her, his expression stripped of all guards, leaving only a profound vulnerability. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice quiet in the morning stillness. And so he told her everything. He spoke of a time before time, when he was not Kael, the mechanic, but Kael, a prince of the celestial architects. His people were weavers of light, shapers of star systems. His love, his betrothed, was Lyra, a woman with hair of spun silver and a soul that sang in harmony with the cosmos, the woman from Nova's dreams. But she had been struck by a blight, a cosmic decay that even their power could not heal. In his hubris and grief, Kael had attempted the forbidden. He tried to reignite her fading life force by collapsing a living star, intending to channel its raw energy into her. But his control slipped. The star didn't just collapse, it inverted, creating a wound in the fabric of reality, the hollow star, and in the ensuing chaos, Lyra was lost completely. His crime had unbalanced the celestial harmony, its echoes causing nascent systems to fail. His punishment was exile, to be stripped of most of his power and bound to a primitive world, to live a mortal life of atonement until his grief and guilt eroded him into dust. "Her soul," he finished, his voice thick with the unshed tears. "It wasn't destroyed. It fractured, echoed across time and space. You are its most perfect echo, Nova. That's why you could dream my memories. That's why the hunter could find me through you." He looked at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it was painful. "They know I am here now. My existence puts you in danger. I can erase your memory of me, of all of this. I can sever the connection. You would be safe. You could go back to your life, to your stars." He gave her a choice, a safe, empty peace, or a dangerous, uncertain future together. Nova looked at the man beside her, the fallen prince who had offered to obliterate himself from her mind for her own protection. She thought of her quiet, lonely life before, her passion confined to cold data and distant, untouchable lights. She was no longer just a stargazer. She was part of the story of the stars. He was her star. Without hesitation, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Then she reached out and laid her palm over his heart, where she could feel the faint thrum of his celestial energy and a small star-shaped scar she had discovered during the night. "Don't you dare," she whispered. Her choice was made. The love they made that morning was nothing like the desperate reclaiming passion in the garage. This was a soulful renewal, a promise sealed in the quiet light of a new day. His kisses were slow and tender, tasting of the coffee she had made, speaking of shared mornings and a future, not just a fleeting stolen moment. It was a dance of equals. She was no longer just a mortal woman. She held the echoes of a cosmic songstress within her. He was no longer a prince in penitent exile. He was a man who had found his home. As he moved with her, it was a gentle, deliberate rhythm, a silent vow. Her hands on his back were not just exploring but reassuring. His body, still shimmering with that faint secret light, was not alien, but hers to know. Her touch reminded him what it was to be human, to be grounded, to be loved not for power or a title, but for the flawed, grieving, hopeful soul within. His touch reminded her that she was, and always had been, made of stardust. The act was a quiet conversation, a sealing of their new, shared destiny against the silence of the waking town. He had fallen from the heavens thinking he was lost to the void, a solitary point of light in an endless dark. But as he held her, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against his, Kael finally understood. A soul does not need a whole galaxy to find its way home, only the light of a single steadfast star to call its own. The Last Bell of Autumn. Blackwood Academy was less a school and more a mausoleum of ambition. It stood sentinel on a hill in New England, a collection of Gothic stone buildings that clawed at the perpetually grey sky. Its grounds a carefully curated wilderness of ancient oaks and whispering pines. The air, crisp and sharp, carried the mingled scents of wood smoke from the town below and the damp, sweet decay of fallen leaves. It was a place of gilded melancholy, where the rustle of turning pages in the cavernous library and the distant mournful chime of the bell tower were the only true measures of time's relentless passage. The world outside the iron gates, a world of noise and chaos and messy, unpredictable life, was a distant rumour, a place one read about in leather-bound books but never truly inhabited. Nathaniel Croft, scion of the Croft dynasty, moved through this hallowed space with the effortless grace of a man who knew he belonged, yet felt no particular attachment to it. He was a ghost in his own life, a spectator to his own carefully orchestrated future. His intelligence was a blade he kept sheathed, his wit a shield, his detachment a fortress. He existed in a state of perpetual, cynical observation, a habit born of a childhood spent in sprawling empty houses, where love was a transaction and affection a commodity to be dispensed in carefully measured doses. His father, a man who measured the world in quarterly reports and stock prices, had a life mapped out for Nathaniel that was as predictable as the changing of the seasons. Blackwood, then Oxford, then a seat on the board of Croft Industries. It was a future of immense privilege and profound emptiness, and Nathaniel, in his quiet, simmering rebellion, yearned to disrupt it, to throw a wrench in the works of the great grinding machine of his destiny. His act of defiance when it came was not a grand gesture, but a small, cynical act of sabotage. A philosophy essay, a meaningless exercise in intellectual posturing became his weapon. He didn't plagiarize for a grade, he had no need for such pedestrian validation, but to prove a point, to demonstrate the utter indifference of the system he was a part of. He lifted a passage from a relatively obscure dissertation, a piece of academic arcana he was sure no one at Blackwood had ever read, and wove it seamlessly into his own elegant, empty prose. It was a perfect crime, a silent stream into the void. He was, of course, caught. The headmaster, a man with the weary eyes of a zookeeper who has seen every trick the animals can perform, did not summon Nathaniel's father. That would have been an inconvenience, a disruption to the delicate ecosystem of alumni donations and societal expectations. Instead, he chose a punishment that was, in its own way, far more insidious. "Expulsion is too easy, Nathaniel," the headmaster said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "It's what you want, isn't it? A grand exit, a dramatic severing of ties. No, I think we need something a bit more restorative. You will join the drama department's autumn production of Cyrano de Bergerac." Nathaniel felt a cold, hard knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The theatre, a place of earnest, messy emotion, of overwrought sentiment and performative vulnerability. He despised it. Perhaps, Nathaniel, the headmaster continued, a faint, ironic smile playing on his lips, learning to pretend to be someone else will teach you something about being yourself. And so Nathaniel found himself pushing open the heavy oak doors of the theatre, a place he had avoided for his entire tenure at Blackwood. The air inside was thick with the scent of old scripts, a heady mixture of paper, dust and dried glue, and the faint, lingering aroma of sweat and stage paint. A single bare bulb on a stand, the ghost light, cast long dancing shadows across the empty stage, a solitary sentinel in the darkness. It was in this dusty, hallowed space that he first saw her. Abigail Hayes. She was standing centre stage, bathed in the soft glow of the ghost light, rehearsing a monologue. She was all fire and light, her voice a clarion call that seemed to warm the cavernous empty space. Her gestures were fluid and expressive, her body a conduit for the raw, untamed emotion of the words she spoke. She was the antithesis of everything he was, passion to his restraint, light to his shadow. When she finished, she turned, and her eyes, the colour of warm honey, met his. They were eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade, to the hollow space within. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice still ringing with the echoes of her performance. "I'm here for the play," he said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vastness of the theatre. A flicker of amusement danced in her eyes. "Are you? I didn't take you for the theatrical type." "I'm not," he said, a touch of his usual irony returning to him. "I'm a prisoner of war." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Well, welcome to the front lines. What's your name, prisoner?" "Nathaniel Croft." "Abigail Hayes," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. "I'm playing Roxane." He was, to his eternal mortification, cast as Christian, the handsome but artless suitor, a role he found insultingly simple, a two-dimensional caricature of a man. He was to be the face, the beautiful, empty vessel for another man's words, another man's soul. During their first rehearsal together, his delivery was flat, his movements stiff. He read the lines with a cool detachment that bordered on contempt. Abigail, ever the professional, tried to guide him, to coax some semblance of feeling from him. "The lines are just the map, Mr. Croft," she said, her patience already wearing thin. "The feeling is the territory. Are you planning on visiting or just looking at it from the border?" He had no answer for her. He had spent his entire life learning that feeling was a liability, a port from which one must always be ready to sail. And as he stood there on that dusty stage, under the watchful eye of the ghost light, he felt a strange, unfamiliar tremor in the foundations of his carefully constructed world. It was the first tolling of a bell he had never heard before, a sound that was both a warning and an invitation. The days shortened, the leaves turned from crimson to gold, and the air grew colder, carrying the promise of the coming winter. Nathaniel's punishment became a strange sort of purgatory, a sentence he served in the hidden, forgotten corners of the academy, the echoing empty theatre late at night, the secluded bench in the memorial garden where the leaves fell like silent tears, the hushed upper stacks of the library where the air was thick with the scent of old books and forgotten stories. These became his sanctuary, his confessional, his classroom. He began to stay late, long after the director had called an end to rehearsals, drawn by a force he couldn't quite name. It was Abigail, of course. She was always there, a solitary figure on the dimly lit stage. Her passion, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. She would run her lines, her voice filling the empty space, and he would watch from the shadows, a silent, unseen audience. One night he found the courage to step out of the darkness and onto the stage. "You're going to wear yourself out," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, startled, a hand flying to her chest. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said, and he meant it. "It's fine," she said, her voice a little breathless. I need to get this right." "It's already right," he said. "It's more than right. It's perfect." A faint blush crept up her neck. Perfection is a myth. There's always room for improvement. And so their stolen rehearsals began. Away from the critical eyes of the director and the rest of the cast, they ran their scenes together, over and over again. She coached him, her patience a stark contrast to her initial frustration. She tried to coax real emotion from his guarded delivery, to teach him the language of the heart, a language he had never learned to speak. "You're not just saying the words, Nathaniel," she would say, her hand on his arm, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. "You're feeling them. They're your words. They're coming from a place deep inside you, a place you've kept locked away." During one of these late-night sessions, as she was in the middle of a particularly emotional speech, she faltered. Her breath caught in her throat and a tremor ran through her hand. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, a forced smile on her face. "Just tired," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Long day." But he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of a vulnerability she kept hidden beneath her vibrant facade. It was the first crack in her armour, and it intrigued him more than her strength. It made her real, human, fragile. Their scripts became a silent conversation, a secret correspondence that unfolded in the margins of the printed text. He would leave a cynical comment, a barbed observation, and she would reply with a challenging question, a gentle prodding. Soon the notes became more personal, fragments of their lives shared in the quiet intimacy of the late-night hours. He wrote of his lonely childhood, of the cavernous, empty houses and the ghost of a father who was never there. She wrote of her dreams of the stage, of the burning desire to live 1,000 lives, to feel 1,000 emotions. "Is it easier to love a soul you've never seen?" he wrote one night, his pen scratching in the silence of the empty theatre. The next day her reply was waiting for him. "Is it easier to show your soul when you think no one is looking?" One evening, as they were rehearsing Roxane's speech of love, something shifted. She stood before him, her eyes shining in the dim light, and delivered the lines with a raw, heartbreaking sincerity that transcended the text. For the first time he didn't hear the character. He heard her. He felt the weight of her words, the depth of her feeling, and it was as if a hand had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He felt an unfamiliar ache, a yearning he couldn't name, a desperate desire to be worthy of such profound, unselfish love. In the quiet of the stage, with only the ghost light for an audience, her voice filled all the empty spaces inside him he hadn't known were there. He was a ship that had been sailing on a vast empty ocean, and she was the first sight of land, the promise of a safe harbour. And as he looked at her, at this girl who was all fire and light and life, he felt a terrifying, exhilarating thought take root in his heart. He was falling in love with her. The world, which had seemed to shrink to the size of the small, intimate space between them, came crashing back in with a brutal, unforgiving force. The golden warmth of autumn gave way to the stark, cold beauty of late fall, the trees shedding their fiery leaves like a final, desperate act of defiance before the long, silent sleep of winter. The air grew sharp and thin, and the sky seemed to hang low and heavy over the stone buildings of Blackwood. The shift in the season mirrored the change in their own small world. The quiet intimacy of their late-night rehearsals was replaced by the bright, harsh glare of the stage lights, the critical eyes of the director, the rustling of scripts in the hands of the full cast. The magic of their stolen moments seemed to dissipate in the cold, clear light of day. The collapse came during a full-cast rehearsal, a week before the play was set to open. Abigail was in the middle of a scene, her voice soaring to the rafters, her body alive with the passion of her character. And then, in an instant, the light in her seemed to flicker and die. She stumbled, her hand flying to her head, a look of confusion and fear on her face, and then she crumpled to the floor, a small fragile heap in the centre of the vast empty stage. The world seemed to stop. The director's shouts, the gasps of the cast, the frantic scramble to her side. It all seemed to happen in slow motion, a dream from which Nathaniel couldn't wake. He stood frozen in the wings, a cold, sickening dread coiling in his stomach. The illusion of her wellness, the vibrant facade she had so carefully constructed, had shattered for everyone to see. He waited outside the infirmary, the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic burning his nostrils, the rhythmic beeping of a machine, a maddening counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. Her parents, a handsome, silver-haired couple with the same warm, honey-coloured eyes as their daughter, arrived in a flurry of hushed whispers and worried glances. It was from them that he learned the truth, a truth that was far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. Abigail had a progressive neuromuscular disease, a cruel, relentless thief that was slowly, inexorably stealing her life from her. Her time wasn't just fleeting, it was being actively, brutally taken. The play, he realised with a sickening lurch, was not a stepping stone to a career, a bright future on the stages of New York or London. It was her last great act of defiance, her final desperate attempt to burn as brightly as she could before the darkness consumed her. As he reeled from this revelation, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his father. The conversation was clipped, transactional, a series of commands disguised as questions. Oxford applications, a scheduled flight to London for Christmas. The real world, his father's voice, a cold metallic drone in his ear, awaited. "Don't get distracted by temporary things," his father said. And the words, which had once been a comforting reminder of his own detachment, now felt like a death sentence. He was a coward. The thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of his shock and grief. He was a coward, and he was afraid. Not of her illness, not of the pain and the suffering that lay ahead, but of the love he felt for her, a love that was now inextricably intertwined with the certainty of loss. He was afraid of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her, a pain he knew would shatter him, leave him broken and adrift in a world without her light. He retreated, his aloofness returning like a shield, his cynicism a suit of armour. He avoided the infirmary, the sight of her fragile body in that sterile white bed more than he could bear. He missed a rehearsal, the thought of standing on that stage, in that space that had been theirs, a torment. He saw her fragility not as something to be cherished, a precious, fleeting gift, but as a future of pain he was not equipped to handle. She was a burning star, and he was a coward, already calculating the distance to save himself from the inevitable darkness that would follow her light. He was his father's son, after all, a man who knew how to cut his losses, how to walk away from a bad investment. And Abigail, with her fierce, beautiful, dying light, was the worst investment of all. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke, unleashing its fury on the unsuspecting world. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the old mullioned windows of the theatre, and the rain came down in sheets, a relentless, percussive drumming on the slate roof. It was a night for ghosts and secrets, for confessions and reckonings. The headmaster, his face a mask of weary resignation, had delivered the final blow. Abigail would not be allowed to perform. It was too risky, he said. Her health was too fragile. The words, delivered with a gentle, paternalistic finality, were a death sentence. Her last dream, the one thing that had kept her fighting, had been taken from her. Nathaniel, hearing the news, felt a surge of a rage so fierce it stole his breath. He found her where he knew she would be, on the empty stage, a solitary figure in the dim glow of the ghost light. She wasn't crying. Her grief was too raw, too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of rage in her chest, a fire that burned in her eyes. "So, you came to see the tragic heroine in her final act," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Come to offer your condolences, your pity." "Abigail, he began, but she cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice trembling with a fury that was both terrifying and magnificent. "Don't you dare look at me with pity. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. I wanted a scene partner, not an audience to my tragedy." She turned on him then, her eyes blazing, and the words poured out of her, a torrent of pain and anger and love. She accused him of being a ghost long before he met her, of being too afraid to live a single moment with genuine feeling. She accused him of being a coward, a man who ran from the first sign of trouble, the first hint of real, messy, unpredictable life. Her words struck home, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his defences. He had no answer for her, no witty retort, no cynical observation. There was only the truth, raw and ugly and undeniable. He broke, the carefully constructed facade of the man who didn't care, the man who was above it all, shattered into a million pieces. He confessed his fear, his voice a choked whisper in the vast empty space. Not of her illness, he told her, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate, belated honesty, but of his love for her, of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her. He admitted that she was the first real thing in his transient, meaningless life, the first person who had ever made him feel anything at all. The performance, the one he had been giving his entire life, fell away, leaving only two terrified, vulnerable people, stripped bare in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. The argument dissolved into a shuddering silence, the space between them humming with the unspoken words, the raw, aching need. He stepped toward her, his movements hesitant, his body a question. He didn't touch her at first, just stood before her, his eyes pleading with her to see the utter, complete surrender in them. When she gave a small broken sob, a sound that tore through him like a physical blow, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were both infinitely precious and the only thing anchoring him to the world. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the sweet, clean fragrance of soap and rain and something that was uniquely, indefinably her. He kissed her then, and it was a kiss of profound, desperate tenderness. It wasn't about seduction or passion or desire, but about affirmation, about a silent, solemn vow to stay, to fight, to love for however long they had. His mouth was warm and soft on hers, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped them both. He kissed her, like he was breathing her in, trying to memorize the very essence of her, the taste of her skin, the feel of her lips against his. His hands traced the line of her back, feeling the fragile strength there, the delicate bones beneath the soft fabric of her sweater. He drew shivers from her that were not from the cold, but from a need that was as deep and as vast as his own. When their bodies pressed together, it was terror and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh, every gasp, every trembling breath seemed to carry a lifetime of longing and a promise to face the storm together, for however long they had. The world outside raged, the wind and the rain a symphony of chaos and destruction, but in the small sacred space of the empty stage, illuminated by the single steady glow of the ghost light, they found a quiet, fragile peace, a shelter from the storm. The night of the play's premiere arrived, a night of bitter-sweet poignancy, of endings and beginnings. The air was thick with the scent of nervous energy and hairspray, the backstage area a flurry of activity, a controlled chaos of actors in various states of dress and undress, of stagehands barking orders, of the low, expectant murmur of the audience settling into their seats. But for Nathaniel and Abigail, the world had once again shrunk, this time to the quiet intimacy of her dressing room, a small cluttered space that had become their sanctuary. Nathaniel had made a choice. The airline ticket to London, a symbol of his old life, of his carefully orchestrated future, lay torn in half in the bottom of a wastebasket. He had called his father, his voice steady and clear, and informed him that he would not be flying to London for the holidays. He was staying. He was not running, not anymore. He had used his family's resources, the privilege he had once so despised, not to escape, but to create. He had arranged with the theatre tech to have the stage for 1 hour before the official show, a single stolen hour in the eye of the storm. He led Abigail, her hand in his, to the empty theatre. The stage was not lit with the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlights, but with a soft, warm glow, a single, perfect circle of light in the centre of the vast, empty space. He had filled the wings with her favourite flowers, late blooming autumn roses, their scent a sweet, fragrant promise in the dusty air. For an audience of one another, they performed their final scene from Cyrano, the balcony scene where love is confessed purely, through words, through soul. They didn't need the costumes, the props, the artifice of the stage. They were not Christian or Cyrano or Roxane. They were just Nathaniel and Abigail, and the words, which had once been a map to a territory he was afraid to visit, were now the truest expression of his heart. When they finished, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, resonant with the depth of their shared emotion. As the final bell of autumn tolled across the campus, a sound that was no longer mournful but a gentle, poignant reminder of the preciousness of time, they sat on the edge of the stage, their legs dangling into the darkness of the orchestra pit. He told her then, his voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet of the empty theatre, that he had deferred his acceptance to Oxford for a year. He wasn't running. He was staying. For her, for them, for whatever time they had left. Back in the quiet of the dressing room, the sounds of the official play beginning were a distant murmur, a world away. They were exhausted, emotionally bare, their hearts laid open. There was no need for grand passion now, for desperate clinging kisses. There was only a profound, resonant closeness, a quiet intimacy that was more powerful than any performance. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm, and brought it to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. He read to her from a book of poetry they both loved, his voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet room, a gentle melody against the distant, muffled sounds of the play. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing into his. The intimacy was in the shared silence, the complete lack of pretense, the simple, profound comfort of being together. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her temple, a promise not of forever, but of now, of this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. It was a connection that was absolute, a quiet bloom of love in the face of an encroaching winter. As he looked at her, at the way the dim light of the dressing room softened the lines of her face, at the gentle rise and fall of her chest, he knew that a life was not measured in the number of its seasons, but in the one autumn that truly matters, the one that teaches us to love against the falling of the leaves. The last autumn leaf caught by the wind tapped against the dressing room window, a gentle, insistent reminder of the beauty and the fragility of it all. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Croft was not afraid. He was home. The Solitude of Winter. The world had been bleached of colour, leaving only the stark monochrome of snow and shadow. In the deep, hushed forests of the Pacific Northwest in the early winter of 1805, the silence was a living thing. It was a profound, ancient quiet, broken only by the sibilant whispers of the wind as it wound its way through the stoic, snow-laden firs. It was a silence Henry Wren had actively sought, a silence he had cultivated for a decade as a shield against the cacophony of a world he had long since abandoned. But on this day the silence was broken. A thin, improbable plume of smoke, a stark grey finger against the bruised lavender of the twilight sky, drew his eye. It was a smudge on the otherwise untouched canvas of the winter landscape. His first thought was of a rival trapper, a trespasser on his self-proclaimed territory, or perhaps an indigenous encampment, though he had seen no signs of the local tribes for months. Caution, a finely honed instinct that had kept him alive in this unforgiving wilderness, took hold. He tethered his snowshoes, his movements economical and silent, and began to move toward the smoke, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He found it nestled in a small sheltered clearing, a cabin, small and moss-covered, looking as though it had sprouted from the very earth itself. It was a fragile sanctuary against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The smoke rose from a crudely fashioned stone chimney, a brave defiance against the encroaching cold. He circled the cabin once, his eyes scanning for any sign of threat. He saw none, only the small, well-tended structure, a testament to someone's desperate will to survive. He approached the door, his moccasins making no sound on the packed snow, and knocked. The door creaked open a hand's breadth, and a pair of eyes, startlingly blue in a pale, thin face, peered out at him. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, though her eyes held a sorrow that seemed to age her beyond her years. She was wary, almost wild, like a cornered animal, but there was a fire in her gaze, a fierce, untamed flicker that he had not expected. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a low, husky whisper, as if she had not used it in some time. "Henry Wren," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble from disuse. "I saw your smoke." She opened the door a little wider, revealing a small, sparsely furnished interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow on the rough-hewn walls. A faded, leather-bound journal lay open on a small table, its pages filled with intricate sketches of flora and fragmented, elegant script. She clutched the journal to her chest as if it were a shield. "I am Honora Quinn," she said, her chin lifting with a defiant tilt that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. He had heard whispers at the distant Hudson's Bay Company outpost of a lost missionary expedition, a fool's errand into this untamed land. He had dismissed it as another tale of civilized arrogance meeting a wild, unforgiving end. But here was a survivor, a ghost from that forgotten story. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man who had sought the silent company of the pines, and now here was another soul to tend to, a complication he had not sought. The outpost had tasked him, should he find any survivors, to escort them back to civilization, a task he now grudgingly accepted. "You're a long way from home, Miss Quinn," he said, his tone gruff. "The snows are deep, but once they clear, I'll see you back to the outpost." "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "Not yet." "This is no place for a woman alone," he said, his gaze sweeping over her thin frame, the dark circles under her eyes. "I am not alone," she said, her eyes flashing. "I have the dead to tend to." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment the fire in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a profound, bottomless grief. "I will not leave until the earth claims what is hers, and I comprehend why this earth spared me and took all others." She told him then of the illness that had swept through her expedition, taking her family, her colleagues, one by one. She spoke of a gentle, silent tribe who had found her, nursed her back from the brink of death, and then, as mysteriously as they had appeared, vanished. He found himself listening against his will to her story. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and he knew he could not force her to leave. Not yet. Another soul to tend to, he thought, a familiar weariness settling in his bones. When all I sought was the silent company of the pines, yet there is a strange fire in her eyes, even amid such desolation. As if to punctuate her defiance, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that rose to a furious shriek. The sky, already dark, grew blacker still. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, obscuring the world outside the small cabin in a swirling vortex of white. A blizzard, sudden and ferocious, descended upon them, trapping them in the small lodge. An uneasy truce was declared, not by words, but by the shared, unspoken understanding that for now they were bound together by the storm. Henry stepped inside, shaking the snow from his furs, and closed the door against the raging wind. The sound of the howling gale was a constant reminder of their isolation, a wild, untamed voice in the profound silence of the forest. The scent of pine resin and wood smoke from the hearth filled the small space, a small comfort against the biting cold. Honora watched him, her hand still clutching her journal, her eyes a mixture of fear and a strange, reluctant curiosity. He is a creature of this wild, she thought, as unyielding as the mountains. But there is a hidden current in his gaze, like a river beneath ice. The distant mournful cry of a lone wolf echoed through the storm, a sound that seemed to mirror her own profound sense of solitude. But now she was not entirely alone. She was trapped with this stranger, this man of the wilderness, and in the heart of the storm a fragile, uncertain spark had been ignited. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the relentless rhythm of the storm. The world outside the small cabin was a maelstrom of wind and snow, a wild, chaotic dance of white. But within the lodge, a fragile intimacy began to bloom, warmed by the flickering firelight and the slow, hesitant unfolding of two solitary lives. The initial wary tension that had hung between them like a shroud began to dissipate, replaced by a growing understanding, a quiet recognition of a shared, unspoken loneliness. Confined by the snow, they began to learn the contours of each other's pasts. Henry, a man of few words, spoke in fragments, his stories like stones worn smooth by the river of time. He told her of a life in the East, a life of noise and crowds and a suffocating hypocrisy that had driven him to seek solace in the vast, silent wilderness. He spoke of a disillusionment with society, a betrayal he did not name but that had etched deep lines of cynicism around his eyes. He had come to the wild seeking a kind of purity, a stark, honest reality that the world of men had denied him. Honora, in turn, shared the tragic tale of her missionary expedition. She spoke of her father's fervent, unwavering faith, a faith that had led them into this untamed land with Bibles and hymns, armed against the wilderness with nothing but their belief. She spoke of the illness, a swift and merciless plague that had claimed her family and colleagues, leaving her the sole survivor in a landscape of death. And she spoke of the tribe, the silent, gentle people who had emerged from the mist like spirits, their faces painted with ochre and kindness. They had nursed her back to health with herbal remedies and a quiet, patient care that had felt like a benediction. And then they had vanished, leaving behind only a handful of carved wooden totems and a profound, unanswered question. They came out of the mist like spirits, she said one evening, her voice soft, her gaze lost in the dancing flames of the hearth. They showed me kindness when the world had only shown me loss. I owe them my life, and an answer. Henry watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. She speaks of spirits, he thought, but she is the most spirited soul I've encountered in a decade. Her sorrow is a deep well, but her determination a towering peak. They fell into a routine born of necessity and a surprising unspoken companionship. They mended his traps, her small nimble fingers surprisingly adept at the intricate work. They prepared their meagre meals together, the small cabin filled with the aroma of roasting rabbit and the bitter, comforting scent of coffee, shared from a single tin cup. Their movements, initially hesitant and clumsy, became a synchronized, unconscious dance. They moved around each other in the small space with a growing ease, a silent acknowledgement of the other's presence. The nights were the hardest, the howling wind a constant reminder of their vulnerability. On one particularly fierce night, the storm seemed to claw at the very foundations of the cabin, the wind a ravenous beast seeking entry. The cold was a physical presence, a creeping, insidious thing that even the fire could not entirely hold at bay. They huddled together under a single, coarse blanket, the shared warmth a small, defiant act against the vast, indifferent cold. They did not speak, but in the shared silence, in the small, intimate sounds of their breathing, a new language was being forged. He felt the fragile tremble of her body next to his, and an unfamiliar, protective instinct stirred within him. He was a man who had prided himself on his solitude, on his self-sufficiency. But in the quiet darkness of the cabin, he found himself wanting to shield her from the storm, from the grief that still clung to her like a winter frost. He began to see past her fragility, to the remarkable resilience and keen intellect that lay beneath. Honora, in turn, felt a warmth she had not known since her family had perished, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. His presence, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become a comfort, a steady, grounding force in her tumultuous world. She saw beyond his gruff exterior, to the deep, quiet strength and surprising tenderness that he kept hidden from the world. His presence, she thought, as she drifted off to sleep, her head resting on his shoulder, like the steady glow of the embers, chases away the chill that has settled in my bones. One evening, after a long, companionable silence, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "This wilderness, it strips you bare, doesn't it? Shows you what truly matters." She looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes," she whispered, "it does." The rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves had begun, a slow, steady metronome marking the passage of time. The storm was breaking, but in the heart of the lodge, in the shared warmth of the fire and the quiet intimacy of their forced confinement, something new and fragile had taken root, a hesitant bond that felt as real and as vital as the coming spring. The first signs of spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden, almost violent awakening. The relentless drip of melting snow from the eaves became a steady, rushing cascade. The sound of rushing water, once a distant whisper, grew to a roar as the frozen rivers began to break free from their icy prisons. The world outside the cabin was being reborn, but instead of relief, the coming of spring brought a palpable sense of dread. The end of their isolation was imminent, and with it, the encroachment of a world they had both, in their own ways, sought to escape. The arrival of the scout was as abrupt as the thaw. He was a wiry, weathered man, his face a roadmap of hard-bitten experience. He had braved the melting snow and treacherous half-frozen rivers to deliver a message from the Hudson's Bay Company. It was an ultimatum, its language curt and official, demanding Honora's immediate return. Rumours of the lost expedition had reached the ears of civilization, and the company, ever mindful of its reputation, wanted the matter settled. "They seek you, Miss Quinn," Henry said, his voice gruff as he handed her the creased and damp message. "The world beyond these woods demands its due." Honora read the message, her hands trembling. The words on the page felt like a summons from a life she no longer recognised, a life of drawing rooms and polite society, of stifling corsets and meaningless pleasantries. Simultaneously, the scout brought word of her own family. A search party sent by her distant relatives was on its way, but their concern, she knew, was not for her welfare, but for her inheritance, for the potential scandal of a young, unmarried woman lost in the wilderness. "My family," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They care only for appearances, but to stay, to leave my past unsettled, feels a betrayal." The weight of her lost companions, of her unresolved grief, settled upon her once more. The warmth they had cultivated in the small cabin, like fragile spring shoots, was threatened by the frost of expectation and duty. A tension thick and suffocating descended upon the small lodge. The easy companionship they had forged in the heart of the storm was replaced by a strained silence, a distance that felt as vast and as cold as the winter snows. They retreated into themselves, each grappling with their own fears, their own uncertainties about the future. Henry watched her, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. The thought of losing her, of returning to the silent company of the pines, was a pain he had not anticipated. He had grown accustomed to the sound of her voice, to the sight of her bent over her journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had grown accustomed to her. To bring her back to that world, to the stifling constraints of a society he despised, felt like caging a wild bird. But what claim had he to keep her here? He was a trapper, a man of the wild, a man with nothing to offer a woman of her station. "Your world is one of drawing rooms and polite society," he thought, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. "Mine of traps and silent forests." The silver locket she wore, a last tangible link to her lost family, seemed to glint with a new, accusatory light. It was a reminder of who she was, of the world to which she belonged. A map, spread out on the table, marked the vast, daunting distance between the lodge and civilization, a stark visual representation of their impending choice. The sudden quiet after a snowfall, once a source of peace, now felt heavy and oppressive, filled with unspoken words, with the weight of their divergent paths. Honora, too, felt the chasm opening between them. She saw the familiar, guarded expression return to Henry's face, the stoicism he used as a shield against the world. The warmth and tenderness he had shown her in the heart of the storm seemed to have retreated, like a river freezing over once more. The lodge, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place of confinement where she was forced to confront the impossible choice before her. To leave was to betray the memory of her lost companions, to abandon her search for the tribe who had saved her life. But to stay was to defy the world, to abandon her family, her inheritance, her entire life. And what of Henry? He was a man of the wild, a man who had made his peace with solitude. Could she ask him to share his life with her, to disrupt the quiet rhythm of his existence? The dripping water outside the cabin was no longer a comforting sound, but a ticking clock, each drop a reminder of the inexorable march of time, of the world that was coming to claim her. The rift between them grew wider with each passing day, a silent, painful chasm filled with the unspoken anxieties of a future that seemed determined to tear them apart. The air in the lodge grew thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken desires and raw, festering fears that had taken root in the silence between them. The approaching spring, with its tumultuous, roaring river and the raw, earthy scent of awakening soil, seemed to mirror the storm that was brewing within the small cabin. The fire, once a source of comfort, now crackled with a nervous, urgent energy, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls like tormented spirits. The confrontation, when it finally came, was as sudden and as violent as a summer squall. It was ignited by the arrival of another message, this one from Honora's family, delivered by a second, equally determined scout. It was not a request but a command, laced with threats of legal action and social ruin. They would see her returned, whether she wished it or not. "They will drag me back," Honora said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and despair. She crumpled the letter in her fist, her knuckles white. "They will put me on display, a cautionary tale for any woman who dares to stray from the path they have chosen for her." "Then you must go," Henry said, his voice flat, his face a mask of stoic indifference. But his eyes, dark and turbulent, betrayed the storm that raged within him. "Go?" she cried, her voice rising. "Go where? Back to a life that feels like a tomb, to a world that values appearances above all else." She paced the small space like a caged animal, her movements frantic, desperate. "Do you not see, Henry? I cannot simply walk away from what happened here. I cannot abandon the only place I have felt truly alive since the ice claimed them." Her words, raw and desperate, hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea. And in that moment the dam of his carefully constructed solitude, the wall he had built around his heart for a decade, finally broke. "What of me, Honora?" he asked, his voice a low, ragged growl. He stepped towards her, closing the distance between them, his gaze intense, his usual stoicism cracked by the storm within him. "Do you imagine this time, these weeks, have meant nothing but duty?" He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of raw, unadulterated sensation that sent a shiver through her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes, wide and searching, meeting his. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of a raw, undeniable desire. "What are you saying, Henry?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. He said nothing. Instead, he pulled her closer, his other hand finding the small of her back, drawing her against him, a scent of pine and man, a scent that had become as familiar to her as her own, enveloped her. Their bodies pressed together, a hesitant fit at first, then a surrender, a perfect, exquisite alignment of bone and muscle and flesh. His lips found hers, not with the gentle expiration of a first kiss, but with a desperate, all-consuming hunger, a kiss of longing and of quiet, profound understanding. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and shared fears, of a connection forged in the heart of the storm. It was slow, deliberate, a deep, languorous exploration of the contours of her mouth, as if he were seeking a lost language, a forgotten truth. Her hands rose, her fingers tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, clutching his deerskin vest as if to anchor herself in this new, exhilarating reality. He deepened the kiss, a soft groan escaping him as she responded with an eagerness that matched his own, her mouth opening under his, a silent invitation. Their sighs mingled in the quiet lodge, a testament to the powerful, undeniable current that had flowed between them, now unleashed. He lifted her then, his strong arms cradling her as if she were as weightless as a feather, and carried her to the narrow cot, the one she had slept in alone for so long. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, his gaze a mixture of reverence and a raw, untamed hunger. He began to undress her, his fingers, surprisingly nimble for a man of his size and strength, working the buttons of her simple dress with a slow, deliberate care. Each touch was a caress, a spark that ignited a fire deep within her. The rough, callous skin of his hands against the soft, smooth skin of her belly, her ribs, her breasts, was a revelation, a sensory explosion that left her breathless. She, in turn, reached for him, her hands clumsy with a need that was as new as it was overwhelming. She pulled at his deerskin vest, her fingers fumbling with the leather ties. He stilled her hands, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Yes," she said, her voice a soft, certain whisper. "I want you." The shirt fell away, and she ran her hands over the hard planes of his chest, marvelling at the heat of his skin. He drew her to him, their bodies fitting together with a closeness that stole her breath. His mouth moved from hers, tracing a path of fire down her throat to the hollow of her collarbone, a silent promise of what was to come. She gasped, her hands clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into pure sensation. Her back arched as he held her, a silent, instinctive plea. He moved with her, his body a warm, steady presence that was both a comfort and a promise. He laid her gently on the narrow cot, the rough blanket a stark contrast to the softness of the moment. In the dim, flickering light, his eyes were dark and tender, full of a vow that made her heart ache, with a beautiful, terrifying vulnerability. He held her close, the warmth of his body a profound comfort against the chilling prospects of the world outside. The sound of the river, a tumultuous roar, was a distant echo to the thunder of their own hearts. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. The single word a profound plea, a promise, a prayer. "Stay with me." There was only this raw elemental connection, a perfect and exquisite union of two solitary souls. As he leaned over her, the last thing she saw before her eyes drifted closed was the profound love in his gaze, and she surrendered not just her body but her heart into his keeping. In the aftermath of their passion, in the quiet intimacy of their shared embrace, the choice was made. It was not a choice born of logic or reason, but of a deep, undeniable truth. They belonged here, in this wild, untamed land, together. The decision once made settled upon them with the gentle, quiet grace of a summer dawn. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed them was replaced by a profound sense of peace, a quiet, joyful certainty that resonated with the vibrant, awakening wilderness around them. The lodge, once a refuge from the storm, a crucible for their burgeoning love, was now a foundation, the cornerstone of a new beginning. They chose to remain, to turn their backs on the world that sought to claim them, to forge a new life in the heart of the wild. Henry, with a quiet determination, committed to helping Honora find the answers she sought. Together they began to explore the surrounding forests, not as intruders but as inhabitants, their movements guided by a shared purpose and a growing respect for the land. They did not find the tribe, but they found signs of their passage, subtle, eloquent clues that spoke of a deliberate spiritual migration rather than a tragedy. They found an ancient burial ground nestled in a secluded grove of ancient cedars, the graves tended with a care that suggested a recent reverent departure. They found a hidden message etched into a rock face, a series of symbols that seemed to speak of a journey, of a people moving on, not in haste but with a sense of purpose, of a connection to a land that was not bound by a single location. It was enough. It was the closure Honora had so desperately sought, a release from the burden of her past. They returned to the lodge no longer as two solitary individuals, but as a unit, a partnership. They began to adapt the small cabin, making it their permanent home. Henry, with his practical knowledge of the wilderness, taught her how to read the signs of the forest, how to track game, how to survive and to thrive in this untamed land. Honora, with her keen intellect and her artist's eye, brought a new sense of beauty and order to their small world. She cultivated a small garden, coaxing vibrant green shoots from the rich, dark earth. She filled her journal not with fragmented memories of loss, but with intricate sketches of their new life, of the wild flowers that bloomed in the meadows, of the eagles that soared overhead, a symbol of their newfound freedom and partnership. Their life was one of hard work, of shared labour, but it was a life of profound joy. They built not just a home, but a future, a life defined by their mutual respect, their deep, abiding love, and their shared connection to the land. The lodge, once a symbol of their forced intimacy, was now a testament to their chosen one, its small rooms filled with the comfortable clutter of a shared life, the scent of wood smoke and wild flowers, of love and of home. Months later, as the gentle, languid warmth of summer settled over the valley, they stood by the river, the water rushing past, a strong, steady current that mirrored the quiet flow of their contentment. The sun, a golden benediction, filtered through the lush, green canopy of leaves, dappling their skin with a warm, gentle light. Henry turned to Anora, his gaze soft, reverent. Her hand, no longer pale and thin, but strong and sun-kissed, reached for his. Their fingers intertwined, a comfortable, familiar joining that spoke of countless shared moments, of a love that had grown as wild and as resilient as the forest around them. He pulled her gently into his embrace, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart, a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own. The gentle caress of his hand on her back, through the light fabric of her simple dress, sent a quiet tremor through her, a familiar, delicious ache that was both a memory and a promise. "This," he whispered, his voice a low, contented rumble. "This is home, Anora." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a love that was as deep and as boundless as the wilderness that surrounded them. "More than home," she replied, her voice thick with an emotion that was too profound for words. "It is everything." He bent his head, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and deeply passionate, a kiss that spoke of quiet mornings and shared labour, of long, languid afternoons and nights filled with a fierce, unbridled passion. It was a kiss that held the promise of forever, a promise forged in the untamed heart of the wilderness, a quiet affirmation of their shared future. It was a kiss that spoke of a love that had found its truest expression far from the judging eyes of the world, a love as untamed, as enduring, and as beautiful as the land itself. In the heart of the wild, where the world had once taken everything, they had found not just survival, but a love as enduring and boundless as the ancient forests, a whispered promise carried on the wind that some souls are destined to bloom far beyond the reach of civilization. Eitan and Ruth, an Oxford love story. The soul of Oxford in late autumn was a melancholic inhalation of decay, the sweet fungal scent of fallen leaves dissolving into damp earth, the sharp perfume of rain on ancient, indifferent stone. It was a city of ghosts, and Ruth Adler felt their chill in her bones. An American adrift in a sea of hushed reverence, she found the university's grandeur less inspiring than oppressive. Its halls, built for the certitude of centuries, seemed to mock her very modern, very private state of intellectual and emotional confusion. She was a scholar of questions in a world that seemed to trade only in prescribed answers. It was this feeling of being unmoored that led her to a sparsely populated lecture on medieval Jewish philosophy, held in a forgotten room in a lesser-known college. The air was thick with the brittle aroma of old paper and beeswax. Sunlight, thin and golden as spun sugar, slanted through a high, mullioned window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. She took a seat at the back, expecting little more than a dry recitation of historical facts, a way to pass an evening that threatened to stretch into an eternity of loneliness. Then he began to speak, and the air in the room changed. His name was Eitan Halberstam. He was Israeli, the introduction had noted, a visiting lecturer of some renown. He was a man built of quiet contradictions. Tall and spare, with the stoop of a lifelong academic, he possessed a stillness that bordered on sorrowful. His dark hair was threaded with premature grey at the temples, and his face, handsome in a severe scholarly way, was etched with lines of a grief that seemed too old for his years. Yet when he spoke of Maimonides, the 12th century sage, his voice, though low, was imbued with a contained, smouldering passion. It was as if he held a fire in his cupped hands, careful not to let it burn him. Ruth leaned forward, forgetting the cold, the ghosts, the weight of her own displacement. He was not merely lecturing, he was wrestling with the text, pulling it from the dust of history into the unstable light of the present. He spoke of the Guide for the Perplexed, not as a static theological treatise, but as a living, breathing map of doubt. After the lecture, as the handful of attendees shuffled out with polite nods, Ruth remained in her seat. A question had taken root in her, a seed that his words had watered. These halls felt so cold, so full of ghosts, who spoke a language I couldn't understand, she thought. And then he spoke, and it was as if he'd given a voice to my own silent questions. She gathered her things and approached the front of the hall, where he was carefully placing his notes into a worn leather briefcase. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. "Dora Halberstam?" He looked up. His eyes were a deep, complicated brown, and for a moment they held the guarded look of a man accustomed to being left alone. "Yes? I'm Ruth Adler. I'm a doctoral student from New York." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "I hope this isn't an imposition, but your lecture, you spoke of the deliberate contradictions in Maimonides." He gave a slight formal nod, his gaze sharpening with professional interest. "I did. You presented it as philosophical necessity, a way to speak to both the simple believer and the sophisticated thinker. But I wondered," she hesitated, then plunged ahead, "I wondered if it wasn't also a spiritual one, a reflection of our own internal state. How can one have faith in a world that is so full of inherent contradictions, beauty and cruelty, order and chaos, unless God himself is found precisely in that tension, in the struggle, not in the resolution?" He went utterly still. His hand, which had been about to close the latch on his briefcase, rested on the worn leather. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the professional veil dropped. She saw something flash in his eyes, not surprise, but a profound, startling recognition. It was as if she had spoken a password to a secret society of which they were the only two members. He gestured toward a massive leather-bound volume on the lectern, its pages the colour of old cream. The texture of its cover looked as brittle and fragile as ancient history itself. "That," he said, his voice softer now, losing its lecturer's formality, "is the very heart of the matter. The contradiction is the point." He met her eyes, and the space between them became charged, electric. The low amber light from the single desk lamp seemed to pool around them, separating them from the rest of the darkening room. It is where God allows us to find him, in the space between what is written and what is felt. He held her gaze for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of a shared language. In that moment, an entire conversation passed between them, one of loneliness, of seeking, of a mutual understanding that ran far deeper than the text they discussed. The air vibrated with it, a low hum of connection. Then, as if catching himself, he blinked. The mask of polite distance slid back into place. He snapped his briefcase shut with a decisive click. "A very astute observation, Miss Adler. Thank you for attending." He gave her another curt nod and turned, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor as he walked away, leaving Ruth standing in the amber light, the scent of rain on stone suddenly sharp in her nostrils, her world subtly, irrevocably tilted on its axis. Their subsequent encounters began with the curated randomness that academic life affords. A shared table in the cavernous silence of the Bodleian Library, a nod across a quadrangle slick with rain. These meetings were cloaked in the guise of intellectual discourse. They would debate the Kabbalistic interpretations of creation or the influence of Aristotle on Jewish thought. But beneath the surface of their words, another conversation was taking place. It was in the way his eyes would soften when she made a point he admired, or the way her breath would catch when he leaned closer to trace a line of text in a book they were sharing, his finger hovering just above the page. One grey misty afternoon, he suggested they walk. The air was thick and damp, blurring the hard Gothic edges of the colleges and muffling the distant chime of a chapel bell. They followed the path along the River Cherwell, the water a sheet of polished slate, carrying a flotilla of fallen leaves. A single bright red one caught her eye, a splash of vibrant life on the sombre, flowing water. For a long while they walked in a comfortable silence, a quiet communion that required no words. Then, as they watched a punt glide by, its pole stirring the murky depths, Eitan spoke, his voice low. "My wife. She was an archaeologist. She loved this fog." He said it to the river, not to Ruth, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank. She used to say that history wasn't in the artifacts themselves, but in the spaces between them, the missing pieces. She said the fog did that to the city. It hid the solid things and forced you to see the shapes in between. It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. The word hung in the air, heavy and real. Ruth's heart clenched, not with jealousy, but with a sudden, aching understanding of the sorrow he carried. She didn't offer facile condolences. Instead, she honoured the raw intimacy of the confession with her own. "I think that's what I've been looking for," she said softly. "Not just in my dissertation, but in everything. A unifying theory. Something to make sense of the missing pieces in my own life. It's why I came here. I thought I'd find it in the architecture of old ideas, but instead I just feel unmoored." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were unguarded, filled with a shared melancholy. "I am beginning to understand what she meant," he said, and the she was a ghost between them, but for the first time it was a gentle one, not a barrier. Their next meeting was in a cramped, book-lined tea shop off the high street, a haven of warmth against the encroaching chill of late November. The air smelled of steamed milk and old paperbacks. He brought a book for her, a slim, rare volume on Maimonides' esoteric teachings. "I thought this might interest you," he said, pushing it across the table. When she opened it, she saw it was his personal copy. The margins were filled with his faint pencil annotations, elegant script that was as much a query as it was a statement. Questions, corrections, little arrows connecting disparate ideas. It was a map of his mind. Sharing it was an act of profound trust, a gesture of intellectual intimacy that felt more significant than any physical touch. She looked up at him, the shared warmth of the teapot a tangible thing between their hands. "Eitan," she began, using his first name for the first time. It felt both natural and momentous. "Ruth," he replied, and the simple sound of her name in his mouth was a quiet affirmation. She spent that night in her small, cold room, not reading the book's printed words, but his. She traced the faint graphite lines with her fingertip, a shiver running through her. "His thoughts are here, on the page," she mused, a slow, deep ache spreading through her chest. "It feels more intimate than a touch. It feels like a soul. The distance between New York and Oxford, between student and lecturer, between his grief and her searching seemed to dissolve in the quiet act of reading his mind on the page. The first breath of true winter swept through Oxford, stripping the last defiant leaves from the trees and leaving their skeletal silhouettes stark against a steel-grey sky. The melancholy beauty of autumn curdled into a harsher, colder reality, and with it The easy warmth between Ruth and Eitan began to leach away. The catalyst was a letter, thin and blue, bearing an American postmark. It lay on Ruth's desk like a summons. Her university in New York had confirmed the date of her required return, outlining a rigid schedule for her doctoral defence. The abstract notion of her departure, once a distant haze on the horizon, now had a date, a time, a stark finality. It was in 6 weeks. The words seemed to rearrange the very molecules in the air, making it harder to breathe. She didn't tell Eitan about the letter, but he seemed to sense the shift in her. A new distress hummed just beneath her skin, and he, a man preternaturally sensitive to the nuances of sorrow, responded not by drawing closer, but by retreating. It was a strategic withdrawal into the cold, safe territory of his work. Their meetings, which had become the anchors of her week, grew strained. The comfortable silences were now filled with a tense, unspoken weight. The flow of conversation, once a rushing river, became a trickle, meandering around safe academic subjects. He was Dr. Halberstam again, and she was Ms. Adler. They were 2 scholars in a library, nothing more. The change was a constant dull ache in Ruth's chest. The silence between them in a crowded, buzzing common room was more profound and deafening than the hush of the Bodleian had ever been. She felt as though she were watching him recede down a long corridor, growing smaller and more distant with each passing day. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She caught up with him after a seminar, in a stone-flagged passage that echoed with the footfalls of departing students. The chill of a stone wall seeped through the thin wool of her coat as she stood before him, blocking his path. "Eitan." He stopped, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Ruth, was there a point in the seminar you wish to clarify?" His tone was polite, formal, and it cut her more deeply than any harsh word could have. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to clarify this. Us. What is happening?" She took a breath, summoning her courage. "I don't understand. We were talking, really talking. Now it feels as if we're standing on opposite sides of a locked gate. Did you lose the key, or did you choose to throw it away?" His gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and she saw a flicker of the man from the riverbank, the man from the tea shop, his eyes full of a pain he was trying so desperately to contain. He looked away toward the grey, unforgiving sky visible through a high window. "The key was never mine to give," he said, his voice quiet and rough. He confessed then, not in a torrent, but in spare, clipped sentences that felt like stones being dropped into a deep well. He spoke of his grief not as a wound that was healing, but as a country he now inhabited, a place with immutable borders and a permanent population of 1. "My world has finite borders now," he said, turning back to her. The agony in his expression was so naked it made her want to look away. "I cannot ask you to live in such a small country. It would be a cruelty to let you believe I could offer you anything more than these fleeting conversations. To pretend otherwise would be a lie, and we have been nothing if not honest with each other." The words were meant to be a kindness, a gentle severance, but they felt like a judgment. He was closing a door she hadn't even realised she'd been hoping to walk through. The careful, formal politeness he wrapped around his confession was worse than a heated argument. It was a dismissal. "I see," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She stepped aside, clearing the path for him. "I am sorry, Ruth," he murmured, and the genuine regret in his voice was the most painful part of all. He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the cold corridor until they faded, leaving her alone with the chill of the stone against her back and a silence that was absolute. A storm born of the Atlantic had hurled itself across England and now beat against Oxford with a wild, relentless fury. Rain lashed the leaded glass of Eitan's college rooms, and the wind howled in the chimneys like a tormented spirit. The turmoil outside was a pale reflection of the tempest inside Ruth. It was her last night. Her flight was in the morning. She stood outside his door, the rare book he had lent her held tightly in her hands. Returning it was to be a final, formal act of closure, a neat tying off of a thread that had frayed into painful silence. She raised her hand to knock, the book a cold, hard shield against her chest. He opened the door, and for a moment they simply stood there, the pretense of formality, a fragile skin stretched taut between them. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, the firelight from within his study catching the silver in his hair. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "In the morning," she confirmed, holding out the book. "I came to return this." He took it, their fingers brushing. The contact was an electric shock, arcing across the cold space that had grown between them. He didn't step aside to let her in, nor did he close the door. They remained in the liminal space of the doorway, the storm raging around them. "The storm is terrible," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't walk back in this. Come in, wait for it to pass, one last glass of whiskey." It was an appeal, not a polite offer. She nodded, a single sharp movement, and stepped inside. His study was his sanctuary, a world walled in by books. They lined every surface, piled on the floor, their spines a mosaic of faded gilt and dark leather. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, peat smoke from the flickering fire, and whiskey. The firelight cast huge, dancing shadows that made the room seem both a fortress and a cage. He poured them each a glass, the amber liquid catching the light. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The whiskey burned a welcome path down her throat. Finally she spoke, her voice raw. "You hide in here, don't you? You build walls of books and theories and you call it grief, but it's fear. You're hiding from life." His head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a sudden defensive anger. "And what would you know of it? You with your theories and your youthful confidence. You romanticize a pain you cannot possibly understand. You look at my life like it's one of your texts, something to be analysed and solved." "I look at you like you're a man She cut herself off, unable to say the word. "A man I care for, who is choosing to entomb himself alive. Is that what she would have wanted? The archaeologist? For you to stop digging, to stop searching?" The argument was the spark thrown into the tinder of their pent-up frustration and longing. It escalated quickly, their voices rising over the shriek of the wind. Accusations became confessions. Anger melted into desperation. "You don't know what you're asking of me," he shot back, his control shattering. He slammed his glass down, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "I am a landscape of ruins, Ruth. Do you hear me? There is nothing left to build with." "Then let me be a ruin with you," she cried, tears finally breaking free, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. "Don't you see? I don't want your perfection. I want your contradictions. I want the man who understands that faith is found in the struggle. I want you." The words hung in the air, a raw, undeniable truth. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice broken. He kissed her then, and it was not gentle. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was like he was trying to solve an unsolvable question, his mouth searching and hungry on hers. It was the culmination of every unspoken thought, every shared glance, every painful silent moment. The argument died on their lips, replaced by the raw, irrefutable language of need. His tweed jacket was rough against her cheek as she pressed into him, her hand sliding from his shoulders up into his thick hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. It was a kiss of fire and fragility, a dance of profound longing and heartbreaking tenderness. When their bodies pressed together, the length of him hard against her, it was an answer, not to the future but to the overwhelming, painful present. His hands, shaking slightly, moved from her face, tracing the curve of her back. his touch both a plea and a surrender. Shivers racked her body. He broke the kiss only to murmur her name against her lips, a prayer in the firelit quiet. With a shared, ragged gasp, they began to shed the layers that separated them. The buttons of her coat, the knot of his tie, the hooks of her bra, all clumsy, urgent impediments. Clothes became a frustrating impediment, a barrier to the truth they both desperately needed. Fabric whispered to the floor, a tide of wool and cotton at their feet, until there was nothing left but the heated rush of skin meeting skin. The air itself seemed to crackle, charged with a current that ran from his fingertips to her soul. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his touch reverent, and carried her the few feet to the worn Persian rug before the fire. The heat of the flames licked at her back as he laid her down, his body covering hers not as a weight, but as a promise. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of reverence and a raw, untamed hunger. The firelight sculpted the planes of his face, casting shadows that danced and deepened. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hands began a slow, deliberate exploration. He touched her as if he were a blind man learning a masterpiece by feel, as if he were memorizing the very essence of her. His fingers traced the elegant curve of her hip, the sensitive line of her back, the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against his lips. She arched into his touch, a silent plea and a fierce acceptance all at once, her own hands roaming the hard, tense muscles of his back, his shoulders, pulling him closer into the inferno. This was a place beyond intellect, beyond words. This was the country of the body, a wild and uncharted territory they were discovering together, guided only by instinct and a soul-deep ache of longing. There was a shift, a deepening, a final breathless surrender, as two bodies became one current, moving in a rhythm as old as the storm lashing the windows. The world dissolved into heat and shadow, the frantic beat of two hearts, and the overwhelming sensation of being utterly, finally found. They clung to each other in the flickering firelight, two souls who had finally erased the distance, finding a desperate, beautiful, and profound solace not in words, but in the undeniable truth of the flesh. The storm passed in the deep hours of the night, leaving a profound, baptismal silence in its wake. Morning arrived not with a triumphant sun, but with a soft, pearlescent grey light that filtered through the rain-washed windows of Eitan's study. It was a world made new, clean and quiet. They awoke on the rug before the cold hearth, tangled in each other, and a stray blanket he had pulled over them at some point. For a long time they didn't speak. The academic pretense, the roles of lecturer and student, the armour of grief and the shield of intellect, all had been burned away in the night's fever. What was left was something simpler, more fragile and infinitely more real. A man and a woman in the quiet aftermath. He stirred first, propping himself up on an elbow to look at her. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch tentative, as if he were afraid she might vanish. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was no artifice left in him, only a deep, tremulous honesty. He didn't speak of the future, of her flight, of the impossible logistics that separated them. Instead, he stood, unabashed in his nakedness, and went to make coffee. The simple domestic act was more intimate than anything they had yet shared. He returned with 2 steaming mugs, and they sat together on the floor, the blanket wrapped around their shoulders, the taste of strong black coffee chasing away the last ghosts of the night. Later, as she was dressing, pulling on her clothes in the soft morning light, the unspoken question, "What now?" hung in the air, heavy and fragile. The silence was no longer tense, but it was filled with the enormous weight of the Atlantic Ocean and the thousands of miles that would soon separate them. Eitan, who had been watching the quiet street from his window, turned and walked to his desk. His movements were deliberate, thoughtful. He took out 2 small stiff cards from a drawer and uncapped his fountain pen. The scratch of the nib on the card was the only sound in the room. He wrote his address, his name, his college, Oxford, in his elegant scholarly script. He walked over to her and held the card out. "So you know where to find me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Ruth's fingers trembled slightly as she took it. The card felt solid, real, a tangible piece of her future. It was an anchor. Then he offered her the fountain pen and the second blank card. "And you, Ruth," he said softly, "so I know where to find you." It was a request, but it felt like a vow. She took the heavy pen from him, its weight familiar and comforting. On the blank card she wrote her own name and her address in New York. The simple act felt monumental, a formal pact made in the quiet of the morning. They were no longer 2 separate people defined by his past and her imminent departure. They were 2 points on a map, and they'd just drawn the first line between them. She handed him the card and their fingers brushed. He looked down at her handwriting, then back up at her, a look of profound, settled determination in his eyes. He carefully slid the card into the breast pocket of his shirt, placing it over his heart. "Good," he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "Now we can continue our conversation." He insisted on walking her to where her taxi would be waiting. The streets of Oxford smelled of wet earth and clean air. The stone of the colleges seemed less imposing, softened by the damp, its grey hues richer in the morning light. Their conversation was simple, practical, about the time, the traffic, the weight of her luggage. Yet every mundane word was heavy with unspoken meaning, a testament to the new reality between them. The black cab was waiting at the corner of the lane, its engine a low thrum in the quiet morning. This was it, the moment of separation. But as she moved to open the taxi door, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, holding fast. The emotional barrier that had stood between them for weeks was gone, replaced by a tangible, physical connection. "You will write," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a command, a plea. "I will write," she answered, her voice steady. He leaned in and his mouth found hers. This kiss was a stark, stunning contrast to the storm of the night before. There was no desperation in it, no hunger, only a profound and certain tenderness. It was a kiss of quiet promise, a long, deep and searching affirmation in the crisp morning air. His other hand came up to gently trace her jawline, his thumb brushing the corner of her lip as if to seal the promise there. "Be safe, Ruth," he whispered against her mouth. It was a benediction. He opened the taxi door for her. She slid in, her eyes never leaving his. He held her gaze as he closed the door, his hand resting on the window for a moment before he stepped back. As the taxi began to pull away, she watched him grow smaller, a solitary figure standing against the backdrop of ancient stone. But he was not a ghost anymore. He was a man, solid and real, anchored in the hopeful light of a new day. The logistical chasms, the ocean, the continents, the careers remained, but they no longer felt like reasons to remain apart. They were merely problems to be solved. For 2 unfinished lives, grappling with the contradictions of the past and the uncertainties of the future, this was not an end. It was a difficult, fragile, and exquisitely beautiful beginning. Chords of a different song. The grand drawing room of the Ellison home in Bronzeville was a testament to a life meticulously arranged, each element a note in a carefully composed symphony. Polished mahogany gleamed under the soft glow of sconces, reflecting the muted floral patterns of the Persian rug. The air, perpetually perfumed with the delicate, almost mournful scent of lily of the valley, seemed to stifle any errant breeze, holding it captive within the stately confines. Viola Ellison, seated with an impeccable posture befitting her classical training, felt the familiar weight of these surroundings settle upon her, a silken shroud of expectation. Her fingers, long and graceful, twitched imperceptibly, as if yearning for the cool, crisp ivory of the piano keys, a realm where order reigned supreme. Tonight, the conversation, like the room itself, was perfectly orchestrated. Her fiancé, Julian Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp and undeniable as his perfectly tailored suit, held court. His voice, calm and assured, resonated with the unwavering conviction of a rising NAACP leader discussing civil rights strategies. "Our path is clear, Viola," he articulated, his gaze sweeping over the gathered guests, prominent members of the black community, all echoing his earnest dedication. Discipline, dedication, and an unshakable adherence to the standards we uphold. It is the only way forward to demonstrate our worth, our capability. Viola nodded, a practice gesture, her mind adrift. The words were righteous, important, a melody she had been taught since childhood. Yet, a disquiet hummed beneath her composure, a faint dissonance in her soul. It was during a brief lull, as a new round of drinks was served, that Julian's colleague, a man whose respectability was only surpassed by his stiff-necked disapproval of anything outside the established order, cleared his throat. "One hears of these new establishments," he began, his tone laced with distaste. "These underground jazz clubs springing up in less reputable parts of town. Just noise, of course. A distraction from the real work." He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, as though swatting away an annoying fly. Noise, a distraction. Viola felt a flicker of curiosity ignite within her, a forbidden thought, an audacious spark in the carefully banked embers of her existence. The word noise echoed in her mind, not as a condemnation, but as a thrilling possibility. The piano keys were an extension of her very soul, each note a perfect, predictable harmony. Yet, tonight, a different music called to me, a discordant, dangerous siren song that promised chaos, and perhaps truth. Days later, the quiet rebellion within her could no longer be contained. A thirst for something raw, something untamed by the strictures of her life propelled her. Under the guise of an evening stroll, Viola secretly ventured to the address whispered by Julian's colleague. The jazz club was tucked away down a dimly lit alley, a defiant pulse in the heart of the city. The moment she stepped inside, the world shifted on its axis. The air was a tangible entity, smoky and thick with the scent of whiskey and unspoken desires. Laughter, loud or unrestrained, mingled with the clinking of glasses and the insistent driving rhythm of a bass line. It was chaos, glorious and alive, a stark contrast to the polite, hushed conversations of her drawing room. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dimness, were drawn to the stage. There, bathed in the singular glow of a spotlight, stood a man with a saxophone, Samuel Cohen. His name, she would learn later, carried the quiet weight of tradition, yet his music was anything but. The saxophone was a living extension of him, a gleaming, brassy soul pouring out melodies that were both mournful and exhilarating, a wail of longing one moment, a joyous shout the next. He swayed, his eyes closed, lost in the intricate dance of notes, his whole being infused with the raw emotion of the music. And then, as if sensing her presence, his eyes opened. They were dark and intense, and they met hers across the crowded, swirling room. It was a moment of startling recognition, as though a chord had been struck deep within her that she had never known existed. The world shrank, the surrounding clamour fading into a distant hum. His lips, still curved from the last lingering note, parted in a brief knowing nod. a silent acknowledgement that transcended words. In that instant, amidst the smoky haze and the forbidden music, Viola felt a stirring of something entirely new, something dangerous and utterly compelling. The crisp, cool feel of piano ivory, her world of perfect harmony, suddenly felt brittle, while the smooth, warm brass of his saxophone promised a different kind of truth. A broken classical sheet music page, forgotten on her piano at home, seemed to symbolize the unraveling of her old life, while the smoky, whiskey-tinged air of the jazz club breathed new life into her lungs. The clandestine corners of Chicago's jazz scene became Viola's sanctuary, a stark counterpoint to the formal elegance of her Bronzeville home. The lily-of-the-valley scent of her drawing room gave way to the intoxicating aroma of stale cigarette smoke and the faint, sweet trace of cheap perfume that clung to the velvet banquettes of the club. The tone of her life, once a measured andante, was becoming a hushed allegro, filled with the thrill of transgression and the burgeoning passion she found in Samuel Cohen's presence. At first, her excursions were cautious, tentative. She would slip away after her family retired, her footsteps hushed on the grand staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She would sit in a dimly lit corner of the club, a ghost in the vibrant tapestry of the night, simply to listen. But her gaze, intense and unwavering, always found Samuel on stage. He in turn began to seek her out in the fleeting moments between sets. Drawn by the quiet intensity in her eyes, he would approach, a shy smile playing on his lips, the saxophone still warm from his touch slung casually over his shoulder. Their conversations began with music, a shared language that transcended their disparate worlds. He spoke of jazz not as mere notes on a page, but as a living, breathing entity, a spontaneous expression of the soul. "Music, Miss Ellison," he'd murmur, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent shivers down her spine, "isn't about rules. It's about feeling. It's about breaking free." Viola, accustomed to the rigid structure of classical compositions, found herself captivated by his philosophy. She spoke of her own reverence for the masters, the mathematical precision of Bach, the soaring emotion of Chopin, but confessed, "My whole life I've played the notes perfectly, but what if the song itself is wrong for me?" He listened, truly listened, his dark eyes discerning, seeing past her polished exterior to the yearning beneath. "There's a fire in you, beneath all that calm," he observed, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I hear it in the way you listen." These exchanges deepened, spilling over into late-night phone calls. Viola would wait until the house was silent, the last echoes of her mother's clinking teacups long faded. Huddled under a blanket in her room, a stolen moment of rebellion, she would listen as Samuel unveiled his world. He spoke of his family's history, of their journey to Chicago, of the quiet prejudices he faced, even within the city's seemingly diverse landscape. He shared his struggles to gain recognition, the relentless pursuit of his art in a society that often deemed it a novelty, or worse, a vice. In turn, Viola found herself revealing the stifled dreams she harboured, the crushing weight of her family's expectations, the gilded cage her life had become. Each whispered word, each shared glance was a thread weaving a tapestry of forbidden longing. It felt both terrifying and utterly irrevocably right. One rainy evening, the insistent rhythm of jazz drums still vibrating in her ears, Samuel walked her part of the way home. The city hummed around them, a symphony of distant traffic and falling rain. The cool, smooth feel of the rain on her skin was a balm, a cleansing sensation that washed away the day's polite falsehoods. There was a silent understanding passing between them, a recognition of a bond that defied logic or convention. As they reached the corner of her street, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, he stopped. Without a word, he gently took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against her own. The simple touch was a spark, igniting a fierce, undeniable attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was a silent promise, a dangerous invitation to a world where music truly was about breaking free, and where the most illicit coffee shared in a dimly lit diner tasted sweeter than any grand feast. The walls of Viola's carefully constructed life began to show hairline cracks, each one a testament to the fragile intimacy she was cultivating in secret. The grand, unyielding architecture of society clashed ever more fiercely with the tender, clandestine world she shared with Samuel. The tone of her days grew increasingly tense, punctuated by moments of fear, guilt, and the suffocating pressure of external forces. Julian, with his keen eye for detail and his unwavering focus on their shared future, was the first to notice. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but a subtle shift in her demeanour, a growing distraction that perturbed him. Her usual attentiveness had wavered during discussions of fundraising and community outreach. He confronted her one evening, his voice calm yet tinged with an almost paternal concern. "Viola," he began, his hand resting lightly on her arm, a gesture of ownership. "We have a purpose. Distractions, no matter how appealing, only serve to derail us. Our family, our community, they depend on us to uphold certain standards, to be exemplars." The clinking of ice in crystal glasses at a formal party, cold and brittle, seemed to underscore his words, chilling her to the bone. Soon, whispers began to circulate within the Bronzeville community, insubstantial at first, like smoke, then growing in density. Disapproving glances followed Viola at church. Hushed conversation ceased abruptly when she entered a room. The veiled judgments were a tangible weight, the oppressive presence of a fur stole draped too heavily over her shoulders. Her late-night excursions, once discreet, now seemed to broadcast themselves on the wind. Simultaneously, Samuel's world faced its own pressures. His club, a haven of vibrant expression, found itself under increased scrutiny. Conservative elements of the city, ever vigilant, viewed jazz, and particularly spaces where black and Jewish artists and patrons mingled, as a corrupting influence, a moral decay that threatened the fabric of society. Threats, thinly veiled at first, then more overt, began to circulate. The wail of a police siren in the distance, a common sound in the city, took on a more sinister resonance, a reminder of the precariousness of their chosen world. "This world," Samuel had said to her one night, his voice strained, heavy with weariness, "it doesn't want us to find harmony. It thrives on dissonance." The stark reality of her fractured existence was thrown into agonizing relief at a high-profile NOACP event. The ballroom glittered, a kaleidoscope of respectable finery and earnest ambition. Amidst the powerful speeches and grand pronouncements, Viola felt a profound sense of unreality. It was as if she were moving through a dream, a gilded charade. Then through the large arched windows she saw him. Samuel stood outside, watching from a distance, a lone figure against the glittering facade of her world. The saxophone, his constant companion, was not with him. The contrast between her two lives, the suffocating elegance within, and the raw, untamed passion embodied by the man outside, was sharp and painful. The inevitable confrontation with her mother arrived like a meticulously delivered blow. Her mother, a woman of formidable will and unwavering adherence to propriety, sat across from her, her posture as rigid as Viola's own upbringing. There were no shouts, no histrionics, only a chillingly precise articulation of duty. "You carry the weight of generations, child," her mother stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "The sacrifices made for you, the path laid for your future. Do not cast it aside for a fleeting fancy." Viola's inner monologue screamed in protest. The walls of my carefully constructed life felt as though they were closing in, each brick laid by expectation, each mortar mixed with duty. but the wild, free call of Samuel's music was a hammer against them, demanding release. The rift was no longer a subtle crack, it was a gaping chasm. The air in the Ellison drawing room, usually still and heavy with Lily of the Valley, crackled with an unspoken tension. Julian Vance, his impeccable composure only barely concealing a steely resolve, stood before Viola, holding her fate in his manicured hands. He presented his ultimatum not as a demand, but as a reasoned choice, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. "Viola," he began, his voice measured, "our engagement, our future, it signifies more than just two individuals. It is a symbol. These bohemian interests you've cultivated, they are distracting. They invite speculation. They undermine the very principles we represent. You must sever these ties, return to the path we have charted, or our engagement, regrettably, is at an end." He framed it as a choice for the movement, for her family's legacy, for a world where their influence could truly make a difference. But to Viola, it was a choice between her life and her soul. Overwhelmed, a knot of desperation tightening in her chest, Viola sought out Samuel. She found him in his small, cluttered apartment above the jazz club, sanctuary filled with the scent of old books, lingering incense and the ghosts of countless melodies. The city hummed faintly outside, a distant, indifferent murmur, but inside the world shrank to just them. The saxophone, his silent confidant, rested on a nearby chair. Tears welled in her eyes as she confessed the immense pressure she was under, the impossible choice she faced. The weight of her family, the expectations of her community, Julian's unwavering certainty, it all pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate the burgeoning, fragile truth she had found with Samuel. Samuel listened, his dark eyes understanding, his face etched with a quiet empathy. He offered her no easy answers, no false promises of a world where their love would be readily accepted. Instead, he offered something far more profound, unwavering support, a silent strength that promised to bear witness to her struggle, whatever her decision. He picked up his saxophone, the gleaming brass warm against his fingers. He played for her, just for her, a slow, bluesy melody that was both a lament and a promise. It spoke of his heart, of their connection, and the fierce, unyielding freedom she yearned for. The notes hung in the air, a shimmering tapestry of raw emotion, a silent plea for her soul to choose its own song. The vibrating hum of the saxophone reed resonated through her, a visceral confirmation of a truth she could no longer deny. The scent of old vinyl records and Samuel's unique, musky scent filled her senses, anchoring her to this moment, to him. As the music swelled a tide of raw emotion, Viola, drawn by its magnetic pull, moved closer, her hand tentatively reaching for his. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not merely physical longing, but a yearning for true emotional resonance, a recognition of kindred spirits. He set his saxophone gently on the nearby chair, the sudden silence of the apartment after the music a profound punctuation mark. He pulled her into his embrace, his arms strong and protective. Their kiss was deep, searching, a release of all the unspoken words and forbidden desires that had simmered between them for weeks. His hands cupped her face, then traced the line of her neck, sending shivers through her. She responded with equal fervour, her fingers tangling in his dark, expressive hair, her body pressing closer, hungry for the warmth of him. They sank onto the worn velvet couch, the music still echoing in their minds, a private symphony of their burgeoning love. Clothes fell away, not in haste, but with a deliberate reverent slowness. Each unfastened button, a testament to their growing intimacy, to the sacred trust they were building. Skin met skin, warm and eager, a revelation in the dim light of the apartment. His touch was tender yet assured, exploring her with a profound gentleness that spoke of awe and deep affection. He kissed her collarbone, the delicate curve of her shoulder, then trailed kisses down her body, eliciting soft moans that she couldn't suppress. Viola arched into him, a silent plea, her body singing with a desire she had never known. Her own hands explored the planes of his back, the tautness of his muscles, revelling in the tactile connection. When their bodies finally joined, it was a symphony of sighs and whispers, a meeting of souls as much as flesh, a culmination of all the longing and unspoken promises. He held her close, their bodies pressed together in a rhythm that felt both timeless and new, as if their hearts were composing a private melody of trust and longing. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, her head thrown back, lost in the exquisite sensations, in the sheer undeniable rightness of it all. It was a moment of profound emotional closeness, a quiet triumph of their shared vulnerability and burgeoning love wrapped in the warmth of mutual desire. When they gazed at each other, their eyes reflected not just passion, but a deep, soul-stirring satisfaction, the quiet triumph of finally belonging. A vibrant, hopeful dawn broke over Chicago, casting long, golden fingers across the city skyline. It was a new beginning, a poignant and deeply satisfying one, imbued with a sense of hard-won peace and authentic joy. Viola, standing before Julian Vance in her drawing room, felt the last vestiges of her old life crumbling, not with regret, but with a profound sense of liberation. The conversation was difficult, perhaps the hardest she had ever initiated, but the words flowed with a clarity she had never possessed before. She articulated her need for an authentic life, for a love that resonated with her deepest self, rather than one prescribed by expectation. Julian, though hurt, eventually accepted her decision with a stoic dignity that was characteristic of him, acknowledging perhaps that some melodies simply weren't meant to intertwine. Freed from the gilded cage of her past, Viola began to explore her own musical voice. Her classical training, once a rigid framework, now served as a foundation for a new, expansive expression. She experimented with improvisation, weaving the intricate structures of her youth with the emotional depth and raw spontaneity of jazz. She composed not for an audience of critics or society matrons, but for herself, for Samuel, for the burgeoning artist within. Perhaps she played in small, intimate venues, or perhaps her compositions simply filled the shared spaces of her new life with Samuel, each note a testament to her blossoming identity. Viola and Samuel, now open about their relationship, faced the societal repercussions with a quiet fortitude. Whispers turned to overt judgments, polite smiles hardened into disapproving stares. Yet they found strength and solace in each other, their love a powerful shield against the conventions they defied. They built a life together, challenging the norms not with defiance, but with the quiet power of their unwavering connection. Their home became a vibrant hub of creativity, filled with books, instruments, and the easy comfort of a shared life. The harmonious blend of piano and saxophone music, often flowing freely through their rooms, became the soundtrack of their existence. Years later, the evening light streamed through the window of their shared home, painting the room in hues of amber and rose. Viola sat at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, playing a soft, intricate melody, a new composition, born of both classical discipline and jazz improvisation. It was her own song, a testament to the journey she had undertaken. Samuel entered, drawn by the music, a silent smile playing on his lips. He approached her, his footsteps hushed, and placed his hands on her shoulders, then around her waist, resting his chin gently on her head. She leaned back into his embrace, her fingers still dancing on the keys, the comforting weight of his hand in hers a palpable presence. He kissed the curve of her neck, a tender, possessive gesture, a sounded acknowledgement of the life they had built. They didn't need words. Their connection was a palpable presence, a profound and enduring harmony. He whispered a soft compliment about her music, about her, a quiet reverence in his voice. She turned on the piano bench, their bodies aligning naturally, and they shared a slow, deep kiss. It was a kiss filled with the warmth of enduring love, quiet passion, and the profound peace of knowing they belonged together. Two different chords that had found their perfect unconventional song. The sight of a blossoming spring flower pushing through concrete, a metaphor for their unlikely love, came to mind. Some songs are written in a lifetime of carefully placed notes, others are improvised in the space between heartbeats. But the truest melodies are those we discover when we dare to play a different chord.